From the CISO Series, it's cybersecurity headlines.
U.S. Senator warns of spying push notifications, federal agency breach through cold fusion vulnerability, and a UK nuclear site attacked by state linked actors. These are some of the stories that my colleagues and I have been selecting from this past week's news at Cybersecurity Headlines. And we are now ready for some insight, opinion, and expertise from our guest, Andy Ellis, the operating partner at YL Ventures. Andy, thank you so much for being on the show, making the time, and lending your tremendous voice. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, and happy Hanukkah to everybody who celebrates.
To one and all. Thanks also today to our sponsor, Barricade Cyber Solutions. Recover, resolve, secure. Remember, if you are listening to this in your podcast app of choice, you can join us always on YouTube Live. Go to CISOseries.com, hit the events drop down, and look for the Cybersecurity Headlines Week in Review image. You can click on it. You can join us. We're here every Friday at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. But if you are watching us live, guess what? You can contribute in our chat. We love to hear from you. We love to see everybody get involved in there, lending their unique voice. Ask us some questions. We already got David Cross in there, and he is ripping and ready to go. We got one Mr. David Spark. I think we've heard of him before. Yes, indeed. So get in there, ask your questions, give us your comments. We love to see it. We've got about 20 minutes, though, so let's get into the news. Can't wait to talk about it with you today, Andy. So first up here, U.S. Senator warns of spying push notifications. This comes from U.S. Senator Ron Wyden, who sent a letter to the Department of Justice asking it to ensure continuation of public discussions around push notification spying, basically saying, hey, don't do anything to, dissuade things with the considerable powers of the Department of Justice. The idea behind this is that Google and Apple servers receive data to send as push notification. This could give a third-party insight into how users are utilizing these apps. Wyden's request was apparently based in part on the fact that foreign governments allied to the U.S. have demanded such data from Google and Apple in the past. It's according to a tip that he received in his office, evidently enough to send the letter. So, Andy, this seems to be one of those activities that maybe comes a little bit out of left field. I mean, I thought encryption was supposed to solve all this, right? Meta's encrypting all their apps. It's happy days. I'm just curious, what does the story tell you, though?
So traffic analysis has always been this interesting domain that law enforcement and governments love to use. Like, I don't have to read what's in your letter if I can see that you got a letter from a person of interest. And that's really what they're doing here. You could imagine a scenario where they're like, oh, we're looking for user, Joe Bob 75. We don't know who they are, but we think it might be David Spark. So let's send a message to Joe Bob 75 in this app. And at the same time, let's look for the push notification to go to David Spark's phone. And if it does, maybe that gives us probable cause to go execute a search warrant.
Yeah, this also seems analogous to, I mean, even something we see in the advertising industry, right? Where you're looking at, browser signatures and stuff like their browser headers and being able to create a unique fingerprint on that, like things that you don't think have a tremendous amount of value, but with sophisticated enough analysis, you can really fingerprint someone either for an ad or for a subpoena.
Right, because when most people think about privacy, they're thinking, I don't want you to see what cookies I take out of the cookie jar, but that doesn't mean I don't see your hand going in and out of the cookie jar.
But we have a lid monitoring tool, so we don't need to watch the cookies.
Right.
We
just watch the lid.
All right, next up here, Canadian government agencies have access to phone hacking tools. Documents obtained by Canada's national broadcaster, you might know it as the CBC, revealed that 13 Canadian government agencies have access to tools capable of extracting personal data from phones or computers. In addition to law enforcement and national security agencies, federal agencies dealing with fisheries, environment, media regulation, and government vendors made the list of users. These agencies did not undergo any privacy impact assessment as required by a federal government directive. So, Andy, the agency's justification for using these tools without complying to the directive ranged from internal investigations only, pretty classic line, to we'll get to it later, to we have a warrant. That one seems maybe a little reasonable. This type of activity is certainly not unique to Canada. Agencies everywhere, it seems, want to have access to these types of tools. As we saw in our first story here, I'm curious, what's your take on this?
So I think as an American, this is one of those things that sort of freaks me out. But I have to remember that like Canada does not have the Bill of Rights. There is no Fourth Amendment protection against search and seizure. We regularly see Canadian governments doing things that in the US we would call fascism. Maybe that's a little overblown, but just to put that into context. What often surprises me, and it shouldn't, is how it runs this gamut from it starts as a law enforcement capability and moves into what appear to be general civilian agencies, like the Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission. I'm looking at that and I'm saying, what are they doing? Are they eavesdropping on broadcasters, trying to figure out who's giving them tips? Not really sure what's going on there.
Yeah, that's one of those where the mind starts reeling of what this could, like fisheries. Maybe it's illegal fishing operations.
Might
I'm sure
be.
that's a legitimate concern that they have, but yeah, whether they should have access to those tools. And, Andy, a really important reminder that it's very often we can take a US view of, what we consider privacy and
Exactly.
the legal protections around that. Always a good reminder. Sometimes we think about it in the EU, but Canada has a very specific set of circumstances on its own as well. Next up here, UK nuclear site attacked by state-linked attackers. This is definitely my comforting story of the week. The Guardian reports that threat actors linked to Russia and China breached the UK's Sellafield nuclear site. Sellafield holds the largest store of plutonium on Earth, that's the planet we're on, and serves as a large-scale disposal site for nuclear waste. Sounds like a lovely location. Sources say authorities do not have an exact date of compromise, which always feels great, but initially detected breaches as far back as 2015, which, if you haven't checked your calendar, is a while ago. No word if malware still remains on the site's systems, but sources say it's likely the attackers already accessed its most sensitive data. The Guardian learned the UK's Office for Nuclear Regulation placed the site under special measures last year for cybersecurity failings. That's some British nicety for in big trouble. The regulator only learned of issues after staff at an external site reported they could access Sellafield servers. So, Andy, like nothing about this story feels good at all. All of the details feel various degrees of bad or giving me chills. Where do we go with this story to understand the cascading, what seems like a cascade of failures here?
Yeah. So what's fascinating here is this is the nuclear supply chain. So when I first read the story, I'm like, oh, nuclear site. Oh my goodness. Like, is this a reactor? Is it a weapons depot? No, this is like where the plutonium is stored and then where the disposal is. And I can see, and I'm not excusing, but I can see how the people involved might have been like, oh, we're not that important. But you are literally the supply chain for the nuclear systems of the West. Like, we got to secure the hardware supply chain as well as the software supply chain.
Yeah, like have some supply chain self-esteem. I feel like if nothing else,
that's
we
a
need to
great
promote
phrase.
that. Yeah, you matter. Don't worry. Anything that touches nuclear, please.
Yeah.
Know
like
that
there are lots of people who would like to get their hands on that plutonium. Like maybe we shouldn't like advertise when it's going to be moving around.
Yeah. I mean, that's the idea. I mean, thinking back to just our first story of like the what you can do with a push notification and the value you can get out of that, let alone like where extraordinarily dangerous elements, components of nuclear power can be. I can only imagine. Our next story here: federal agency breach through cold fusion vulnerability.
And that's not a typo. Like I read that 3 times.
Yes, this is not directly related to the same supply chain that we were talking about from our last story here. On Tuesday, CISA confirmed that an unnamed federal agency has been compromised by hackers back in June and July using a vulnerability in Adobe's rapid web application development tool. You might know it as Cold Fusion. The agency had been running outdated Cold Fusion software, which CISA had ordered patched by all federal agencies as of April 5th. CISA's log analysis shows that the attackers inserted malware mainly, but were unsuccessful in exfiltrating any data. So is this a case of a federal agency being caught sleeping at the wheel? We have CISA's regular bulletins about, things that you need to patch on time. Does that seem to be the case here, Andy?
I mean, this one isn't really news in a sense, because I'm not convinced that they've been at the wheel. Like they're in the back of the RV asleep and have been for quite some time. Like this is a regular, to me, what made this interesting is they're still using Cold Fusion. Like how long does it take to move to different platforms is really what jumps out here. Like, fine, you failed to patch the platform that was already outdated, but it's the outdated is what's interesting, that you're like, why are you using Cold Fusion still?
Yeah, it speaks to the I mean, it's no surprise that there's an incredible amount of inertia in any large organization. Government is par excellence with that. But yeah,
Exactly.
the cause and effect there for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Before we move on to our next story, we have to spend a few moments and thank our sponsor for today, Barricade Cyber Solutions. Are ransomware attackers causing disruptions? Remember to stay composed and immediately contact Barricade Cyber Solutions, the trusted ransomware recovery experts specializing in small to medium businesses. Barricade Cyber Solutions has a proven track record of successfully handling over 3,000 business cases and counting, with advanced recovery services for rapid business restoration. Recover from ransomware with Barricade Cyber Solutions. Visit recoverfromransomware.com to learn more. That's recoverfromransomware.com. Before we move on to our next story, David Cross, we're not going to be getting into Andy's thoughts on the New England Patriots and whether they pose a threat to national security along there, or if they're a slow-moving government entity as well, as much as I'm sure Andy would like to get into that.
But I will just point out, with winning last night, the Patriots have not been eliminated from the playoffs and still have a route to the number 7 seed.
Speaking of not being eliminated, U.S. federal agencies haven't been eliminated despite missing incident response deadlines. A new report published Monday by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, or GAO, as we know in the biz, found that just 3 U.S. federal agencies have reached the advanced level, or Tier 3, for cyber event logging. All 23 U.S. federal agencies were required to reach event logging Tier 3 by August 2023. However, 20 agencies have failed to meet the requirement, and 17 have not gone beyond the old Tier 0 level. So, Andy, this episode of Week in Review seems to have a little extra dose of government agency recidivism. I guess, hard challenge to meet, or should we be looking over our metaphorical glasses here?
So this is one that really concerns me, because you have 3 that hit Tier 3, 3 that are on levels 1 or 2, or tiers 1 or 2, and 17 haven't started. Like, this is not good program management. If they're saying, we want everybody at Tier 3 by this point, and you've got 17 of 23 that haven't even started. Like, they haven't got to Tier 1. So what's happening here, and why is it that federal agencies cannot run what are honestly very large-scale programs, but to bring us up to where we need to be? It does highlight how difficult it can be to meet regulation and standards that are being pushed on you by an outside entity, in this case, CISA.
Yeah, and in a changing regulatory landscape as well, which again, I don't want to make excuses, because I'm sure if you talk to some of the directors of those agencies, there are reasons why things aren't moving apace. But it's from an outsider's perspective of, you're right, seeing like that we haven't started yet. I can understand, hey, we're moving slower than we'd like to. We're making progress where we have the roadmap, right?
Right.
I don't see the roadmap there.
I don't see the roadmap. And either this was overly aggressive when in 2021, the executive order came out and said, you got to be Tier 3 in 2 years. Well, was that an inappropriate order? Like, first rule of command is never give an order you know will not be obeyed. Every time you do, you weaken your ability to give later orders.
But kudos to the gold stars that those 3 federal agencies.
Hey, good for them.
Yeah.
I worry that it's the 3 smallest ones, probably.
Wait, let's fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. All right, next up here, EU agreement on Cyber Resilience Act. On December 3rd, the European Parliament and EU Council reached an agreement on the Cyber Resilience Act, which has been in the work for about a year now. The law impacts connected devices across sectors. That's kind of the big deal here. There's been laws that have covered more specific verticals, but this is across everything, requiring mandatory security reporting and at least 5 years of security updates for devices that aren't specifically super short-term devices, while still requiring a formal approval process. This is the EU, so there's regulations on regulations about how to pass these things. The CRA is now set to become law. Once it's entered into the EU's official journal, manufacturers will need to meet requirements within 36 months. So, Andy, Initiatives from governments and councils can sometimes take root. GDPR, for example, is tried and tested at this point, but oftentimes become a bit of an exercise in paper pushing. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about the potential for the Cyber Resilience Act and what it means?
So I'm optimistic on this one. And now we should comment that we just noted all the ways in which people can't comply with their own regulations. So maybe we shouldn't be too optimistic. But what I like about this one is that mandatory sort of 5 years of updates.
Mm-hmm.
So people who are going to comply have to at least do that. And that's a thing a lot of people have been pushing for a long time. No more of this fire and forget. So that's great. Here's the flip side, though. How many of these connected devices are being built by shell companies in China that will build it, dissolve the shell company? They're not going to comply.
The entire white box IoT ecosystem, right?
Right. So the exact people we're trying to target with this already have a business structure that lets them, do one-offs, ship a whole bunch of products, shut down the shell company, open up a new one for the next version of the product, so they don't already have to deal with liability, returns, all of the other issues. So I am cautiously optimistic here. I worry that this will just have a sort of a worse impact in that you have raised the cost of compliance if you're a manufacturer in the US or the EU, and that's going to continue to make it easier for the white box market to dominate.
All right, next up here, gets the Creative Thinking Award for this week. Eufy Flaw opens the door to bootkits. Security researchers at Binarly detailed Logo Fail, a vulnerability in Eufy firmware that allows for hijacking image libraries to bypass the boot validation system on board. This impacts image parsing libraries across firmwares, allowing malicious image files to load at boot. This process doesn't modify the bootloader or firmware components, so it's pretty hard to identify compared to something like the Black Lotus bootkit disclosed earlier this year. Andy, a devious process that can serve as a reminder, you give bad actors a chance, they will be creative. Is this type of vulnerability serious, run-of-the-mill? Like, how should we... It sounds bad. What's the actual threat surface on something?
So I think the threat surface on this one is actually pretty small.
Mm-hmm.
But this one is interesting to me because you have to get to the firmware with that logo that's going to create an issue. At least we'll see when they, if they talk about it, more what's going to happen. But what worries me here is when I was the CISO at Akamai, we had a list of what we called the 10 dangerous libraries. And these are the third-party software, mostly open source, that we'd inherited that exposed us to insane amounts of risk. So we always had to be prepared to deal and patch with them. 2 of them were communications libraries. It was OpenSSL and it was a DNS library. The other 8 were all content parsing, libxml, libpng. So all of the things that take images or other files and parse them. And my goodness, those had vulnerabilities all the time. So the guidance to walk away with here is, before you add a parser library into whatever your software is, figure out if you can just not take the content instead. Like, there is no reason to have a logo in the boot.
But it looks pretty.
It sure looks pretty, but you do not want to have that risk.
Words to live by, for sure. Our last story here, credit unions affected by ransomware attack on a cloud provider, while Roblox and Twitch get a visit from Alf V. This double story here involves up to 60 credit unions across the U.S. facing outages this past week due to a ransomware attack on their cloud services provider ongoing operations, which is owned by credit union technology firm Trellance. At the same time, Alf V/Black Cat, however you want to roll, decided to cut to the chase after breaching the accounting software company Tipalti by shaking down Tipalti's clients, Roblox and Twitch. You might have heard of them. So, Andy, these two, one of many stories we see very often. You have a third-party vendor gets hit, and then you start seeing all of these knock-on effects. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about this kind of perpetual third-party risk conversation? Is this just a cost of doing business, and is this just a resiliency conversation at this point?
So I think it's a risk of doing business. I don't want to just say, oh, we have to accept it.
Okay.
But I think what almost everybody needs to recognize is, go back 20 years and corporations ran their business operations in-house in general, or occasionally outsourced pieces of it. And modern corporations don't operate like that. Almost all of your business operations are running in cloud platforms, and other people are maintaining that software. And when you're in a small industry like credit unions, you often have sort of bespoke companies that do cloud services just for your industry. And they might not be doing things as well as we would expect for people who are in the mass market. Like, I don't expect their cloud services provider Trellance to be as good as, say, Salesforce. And that's a risk, and I think we need to pay attention to that. How many of these industries that are critical to us are sort of on the hook of one key provider that supports an entire industry, but that provider isn't making the revenue of the industry, so they're not investing.
Yeah, because we know the threat actors are going, I mean, case in point, are looking at those, people, especially sophisticated actors, for sure.
Exactly.
All right, well, before we get out of here, we've had some audience comments in here. Now, we've either your name is LinkedIn user or this is an anonymous person on LinkedIn, but they were commenting, I believe, on our the U.S. federal agency updates here and saying, fundamentals. Most people don't do the foundational work, so when they try to do some of the more advanced projects, so they can do some of the more advanced projects before they can progress. Basically saying, it's possibly saying a lot of these federal agencies maybe don't have even that base level of fundamentals in place, and that's what's causing that delay. I think that's certainly might seem feasible.
It certainly does, and I think a lot of times we look at how fundamentals, like, I don't love that word, but they got done because IT did them behind the scenes. Like, while you were trying to roll out a project, you were yelling at IT for how long it took. There was a lot of things happening behind the scenes. Well, now it's easier to roll things out very quickly and skip that whole IT process. And so it's not that you don't know how to do the fundamentals. You don't even know to do the fundamentals.
And James Olson in the chat points out that was Vincent that submitted that. Didn't see his name in there, but thank you, James, for giving proper credit where credit is due. And then we had another comment from David Cross saying, asking, will devices and manufacturers be banned in the EU if they are not proven to comply with the cyber with the CPA that's coming out, or the CRA that's coming out?
I mean, we'll see what the EU actually does, but are they going to cut themselves off from all the innovation coming out of China?
Yeah, maybe I was thinking maybe you do something like you have to have almost like an escrow account, right? Before you could to hit an import status. So if you fail, there is a fund to put to securing stuff. Like, I'm trying to think of how that would even work, but
I'm
that's what my
sure that
mind
if you
goes.
were a large manufacturer, you would love that because it would completely stifle innovation.
Well, stifle competitors, please. Come on, let's the big companies try to.
They do try, and they're very trying.
All right. Before we get out of here, for you, Andy, was there any story that was a thumbs up or an eye roller? Oh, you have to choose one. You have to choose one story.
I can only choose one story. I'm going to go with the Cold Fusion because I will admit that when I saw that, I assumed that this was just a template from like years ago. Like, who is still using Cold Fusion? And honestly, the web server was not that good when it first came out. Like, no.
The only way it could be worse if it was like an Adobe Flash app or something like that, where you're just like, is that how?
Well, that's probably why they were running Cold Fusion, was so that they could do
sad.
Flash in the day. Flash is dead, but they're still using Cold Fusion.
Hey, you thank you, governments, for keeping Cold Fusion in our cultural zeitgeist, at least.
Yeah,
for another
maybe
day.
someday it'll be replaced by real Cold Fusion.
We can throw a banana peel at it, and then we'll deal with the threats from that for all the free power. All right. Well, thank you so much, Andy Ellis, operating partner at YL Ventures, of course, one of the co-hosts of the CISO Series podcast. Just tremendous, fantastic. Thank you so much. Where can people find you on the cyberspace if they are so inclined? So
you can generally find me as CSO Andy, either on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, you name it, or csoandy.com. And you can also find my book on Amazon, 1% Leadership.
Excellent. And are you hiring over there at YL Ventures?
We are. Our entire portfolio set of jobs are posted on jobs.ylventures.com.
Fantastic. So look for that in our show notes. If you don't want to just try and type it out and listen, there's a link there. Don't worry, you can find it. Thanks also to our sponsor for today, Barricade Cyber Solutions. Recover, resolve, secure. Thanks to our audience today for everybody getting in there and submitting. James Olson, David Cross, Kevin Farrell, appreciating my semi-awkward segue. Always super fun to see everybody involved in there. And of course, the one and only David Spark as well. Remember, you can contribute to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. Join in on the fun. Just subscribe to our YouTube channel too, CISO Series, and you'll get alerts when we are going live. Join us next week for Super Cyber Friday, where the topic will be hacking the SaaS security journey, an hour of critical thinking of how to secure your SaaS applications in a holistic way. And we'll also be back with another episode of the Week in Review show, and you can still get your daily news fix through cybersecurity headlines. Every single day, give us about 6 minutes, and our crew will get you all caught up. Until the next time we meet, I'm Rich Stroffolino, reminding you to have a super sparkly day.
Cybersecurity headlines are available every weekday. Head to CISOSeries.com for the full stories behind the headlines.